When I moved into my grandfather's old house, I thought I was inheriting a slice of heaven. The property sat just outside the cookie-cutter chaos of the HOA neighborhood nearby, like a tiny island of individuality in a sea of identical beige conformity. The house wasn't much to look at. Peeling paint, shutters hanging at awkward angles, and a front porch that creaked like it was auditioning for a haunted house. But it had character. Most importantly, it had the tree. The tree was a massive oak, easily 100 years old, its roots sprawling across the yard like veins of a great, ancient heart. My grandfather planted it when he moved in after the war, and it had become something of a family legend. Every summer as a kid, I'd climb its gnarled branches while he sat on the porch, shouting advice like, "Don't fall and break your neck. Your grandmother's already mad enough at me for letting you climb up there." When my mom passed away last year, leaving the house to me, the tree became more than just a landmark. It was a symbol of resilience, of history, of every happy memory I had left. Naturally, I swore I'd take care of it. What I didn't count on was the homeowners association next door deciding it was their business. The first letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked between an Amazon package and a flyer for pest control. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a generic form letter meant for someone actually living in their HOA dystopia. I was wrong. Dear homeowner, your property has been identified as non-compliant with our community standards. Specifically, the large oak tree in your front yard is classified as an unsightly obstruction under Article 4, Section B of the HOA guidelines. As a gesture of goodwill, we kindly request its immediate removal to maintain harmony within the neighborhood. Please ensure compliance within 14 days to avoid further action. Sincerely, Karen Whitaker, HOA President. I stared at the letter for a solid 5 minutes, trying to process the audacity. First of all, I'm not in the HOA. My property was explicitly excluded when the neighborhood was developed, probably because my grandfather refused to join their Stepford nonsense. Second of all, unsightly obstruction? This tree was gorgeous, majestic, even birds loved it, squirrels worshipped it. Meanwhile, Karen Whitaker probably thought plastic flamingos and concrete lawn geese were peak landscaping. I crumpled the letter, tossed it into the recycling, and went about my day. Mistake number 1. 2 weeks later, I found Karen herself standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand and an expression so sour it could curdle milk. "Hi there," she chirped, her voice carrying the forced cheer of someone who'd complain about a lemonade stand for violating zoning codes. "I'm Karen, president of the HOA. I gave her my best fake smile. "Hi, Karen. What can I do for you?" "Well, it's about the tree." She gestured toward it, as if I might have forgotten the hulking monument of bark and leaves in my yard. "We sent you a letter a few weeks ago, and we haven't heard back." "That's because I'm not in your HOA," I said, keeping my tone pleasant but firm. "The tree stays." Her smile twitched. "Well, actually, all properties in this area are subject to our guidelines. The tree's obstructing the aesthetic flow of the neighborhood, and it's causing some concerns about property values." "Aha, let me stop you right there," I said, crossing my arms. "I don't care about your guidelines. My property isn't part of your HOA, and I'm not cutting down a perfectly healthy tree because you think it's unsightly." Karen's expression tightened, like she just sucked on a lemon. "I understand your position, but we really encourage compliance. It's in everyone's best interest. Karen, I'm sure your clipboard's lovely and all, but it doesn't give you jurisdiction over my yard. Have a great day." I turned and walked back inside before she could respond. I'd barely closed the door when I heard her muttering, "This isn't over." Oh, but it was, at least I thought so. Mistake number 2. The second letter came a week later, this time threatening administrative fines if I didn't remove the tree. I ignored it. Then came a third letter, demanding a meeting with the HOA board to discuss compliance. I threw that one out too. I figured they'd eventually get bored and leave me alone. Instead, they escalated. I came home one sunny afternoon to find a team of workers in neon vests standing around my yard. 2 men were revving chainsaws. The tree was already half gone, its branches piled in a messy heap on the grass like severed limbs from a crime scene. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, dropping my grocery bags on the driveway. One of the workers looked up, clearly startled. "We're just doing what we were told. HOA hired us. Get off my property," I yelled. "Right now, or I'm calling the police." Karen appeared from behind a truck, looking annoyingly smug. "There's no need for that. We're just resolving the issue. You have no right to be here," I said, my voice shaking. "This is my tree, on my property. You can't just chop it down." Karen's smile didn't budge. "Actually, we can. Article 4, Section B grants us authority to enforce aesthetic compliance." "I'm not in your HO," I snapped. Her eyes narrowed. "You're part of this community, and the rules apply to everyone. If you'd responded to our letters, this could have been handled amicably." "Amicably?" I gestured to the pile of branches. "You just destroyed something that's been here for generations. You have no idea how much this tree means to me." Karen sniffed. "It's just a tree." "No, Karen. It's not just a tree. It's part of my family history, and you had no right to touch it." She shrugged, unfazed. "You can file a formal complaint if you'd like. But the work's already paid for." The workers, looking increasingly uncomfortable, hesitated. I glared at them. "You're trespassing. All of you. Pack up your chainsaws and get out." They left, though not before Karen handed me a business card with the HOA's contact information. "I suggest you think twice before letting this go further," she said as she climbed into her shiny white SUV. I stood there for a long time after they were gone, staring at what remained of the tree. Its trunk was still standing, jagged and raw where the branches had been hacked off. I pressed my hand against the rough bark, feeling its warmth from the afternoon sun. It was like touching the scar of an old wound, and something inside me hardened. Karen wanted a fight? Fine, I'd give her one. After the HOA's Little Tree Massacre, I spent the evening doing two things. First of all, documenting the entire scene with enough photos to rival a crime scene investigator, and secondly, Googling every possible law about trespassing, property rights, and HOA overreach. Karen thought she could bully me into compliance? Not today, Karen. I wasn't just mad. I was righteously furious. The kind of mad that keeps you up at night, running imaginary conversations in your head where you outwit your opponent with devastating comebacks. In these imaginary confrontations, Karen always ended up sputtering and defeated. Reality, however, was a little messier. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office. "Let me get this straight," the deputy on the phone said, his voice tinged with amusement. "They hired a crew to cut down a tree on your property?" "Yep. Without permission," I said, pacing in my kitchen. "And they trespassed to do it." "Well, ma'am, I don't know much about HOA bylaws." "That's because I'm not in the HOA. But property damage and trespassing? That's another story." He paused. "You want to file a report?" "Yes, I want to file a report. And if you know a good lawyer, I want to file about 100 other things while we're at it." After hanging up, I emailed every photo and video I had of the aftermath to the sheriff's office. I also attached scans of the HOA's letters, plus the business card Karen had smugly handed me, which I now regarded with the same disdain as a parking ticket. But the best part? I wasn't just relying on the law. I was about to turn Karen's own game against her. That afternoon, I headed to the local library. Yes, the library. I figured if Karen and her clipboard army were going to lean on their precious HOA rules, then I needed to see exactly what I was dealing with. Lucky for me, the HOA bylaws were public record. It took some digging, mostly through a binder stuffed with laminated nonsense, but I finally found what I was looking for. Two things stood out immediately. Firstly, the HOA's boundaries didn't include my property. Not even close. Secondly, Karen had absolutely no authority to enforce anything on my land. But here's the kicker. Buried deep in the bylaws was a section outlining the HOA board's accountability. If their actions caused damages, they could be held personally responsible. My jaw almost hit the table. Karen's smugness wasn't just infuriating. It was potentially expensive. I photocopied everything that might be useful, stuffed it into a folder, and left the library feeling like I just cracked the Da Vinci Code. That evening, I invited my neighbor Phil over for a beer. Phil lived 2 doors down, also outside the HOA's boundaries. He was retired, a little grumpy, and generally uninterested in anything that didn't involve fishing or his lazy hound dog. But I had a hunch he'd have some opinions about Karen. "She's a menace," Phil said, cracking open a can of Budweiser. "Tried to fine me last year for parking my boat in my own driveway. Had to remind her my house isn't part of her fiefdom." "What did she do?" He smirked. "She threatened to report me to code enforcement. I told her to go ahead. Never heard from her again." "So she's been overstepping for years?" "Pretty much." Phil took a long sip of his beer. "She's got the board wrapped around her finger. Most of them don't even live here full-time. They just rubber stamp whatever Karen wants. You ask me, she's drunk on power." "Good to know," I said, filing that little tidbit away for later. Phil glanced at the remains of the tree in my yard, his expression softening. "That tree was something special, you know. I remember your granddad planting it. Hell of a shame what they did." "Yeah," I said quietly, "but I'm not letting them get away with it." The next morning, I drove to the HOA office. Technically, it was just a tiny room in the community center, but Karen treated it like the Oval Office. When I walked in, clipboard in hand, for dramatic effect, she was sitting at the desk, tapping away on a laptop. "Good morning, Karen," I said with a saccharine smile. She looked up, clearly surprised. "Oh, hello. How can I help you?" I set my clipboard down with a loud thwack. "I'd like to file a formal complaint." Karen blinked. "A complaint? About what?" "Oh, you know," I said, leaning in slightly. "The part where you illegally trespassed onto my property, cut down my tree without permission, and violated about half a dozen laws in the process." Her smile faltered. "We acted within our authority." "Let me stop you right there," I said, pulling a stack of papers from my clipboard. "According to your own bylaws, you have 0 jurisdiction over my property. None. Nada. Zilch. And since you personally signed off on the work order, you're liable for the damages." She opened her mouth, but I wasn't done. "I've already filed a report with the sheriff's office," I continued, "and I'm working on a civil case for property damage. So unless you'd like to explain to a judge why you think your HOA rules override private property laws, I'd suggest you start writing me a check for the tree." Karen's face turned a fascinating shade of red. "This is completely unnecessary." "Oh, it's very necessary," I said. "And don't think I'm stopping with the tree. I've been talking to neighbors. You've been harassing people for years, Karen." "It's over." Her eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" "No, Karen," I said sweetly. "It's a promise." I walked out of that office feeling like a superhero. Sure, I still had a long way to go, but the look on Karen's face was worth every second of effort. What Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just planning to sue her. I was planning to dismantle her entire empire. And I wasn't doing it alone. Because as it turned out, I wasn't the only one with an axe to grind. If there's one thing Karen underestimated, it was the power of an angry neighbor with too much time on their hands. And lucky for me, she hadn't just pissed me off. She'd been waging her one-woman war on the entire community for years. By the end of the week, I'd assembled a ragtag coalition of disgruntled homeowners and fed-up neighbors. I called it the HOA Survivors Club, though Phil suggested Karen's Victims Anonymous had a better ring to it. Either way, we started meeting at my house, usually around my rickety kitchen table, with coffee and cookies I'd overbaked. Phil was the unofficial VP of the group, mostly because he had the best stories. "She told me my boat clashed with the aesthetic values of the neighborhood," he said during one meeting, gesturing with his coffee mug. "Like her pink flamingo garden ornaments are some kind of cultural masterpiece." Sandra, a single mom from 2 streets over, chimed in. "She fined me $100 for having my trash bins out too early. Trash day wasn't even until the next morning." "And don't forget the mailbox thing," said Ron, an older guy whose gruff demeanor didn't quite mask how furious he was. "She made me replace my mailbox because it wasn't the right shade of beige. Who even cares about beige?" The stories piled up. Fines for flower beds, citations for Christmas decorations, threats over basketball hoops. Karen had a long history of petty tyranny, and every story just fueled the fire. "What's the plan?" Sandra asked one evening, leaning forward with a determined look. We're going to hit her where it hurts, I said. Legally, publicly, and loudly. The first step was gathering evidence. I asked everyone to bring copies of any letters, fines, or emails they'd received from Karen or the HOA. I also asked them to take photos of their properties and document any interactions they'd had with her. Ron came through in a big way. You're gonna love this, he said, handing me a manila folder stuffed with papers. Turns out, Karen's been skimming money from HOA dues. My jaw dropped. Are you serious? Dead serious. I used to be the treasurer before she pushed me out. I started noticing discrepancies in the budget, payments to contractors who don't exist, inflated invoices, that sort of thing. I confronted her, and she said I was misinterpreting the records. Next thing I know, I'm off the board. Ron, you're my new favorite person, I said, flipping through the documents. With Ron's evidence, the case against Karen was starting to take shape. Not only had she overstepped her authority and damaged my property, but she'd also been using her position to enrich herself. It was the kind of thing that could get her removed from the board, and maybe even arrested. The second step was making noise. Phil and I put together a flyer outlining Karen's misdeeds, complete with bullet points like unauthorized tree removal, improper fines and citations, financial misconduct. We printed 100 copies and distributed them to every house in the neighborhood. Some people ignored us, but others were eager to hear more. A few even joined our meetings, bringing their own horror stories to the table. We also started a Facebook group called HOA Reform Now. It was a mix of serious discussions, memes about Karen, one popular post compared her to a Disney villain, and updates about our progress. Within days, it had more members than the official HOA group. Karen, of course, wasn't thrilled about any of this. You're spreading lies, she snapped during an impromptu confrontation in the grocery store parking lot. Actually, we're spreading the truth, I said, holding up one of our flyers like it was Exhibit A. Don't like it? Should have thought of that before you cut down my tree. You're making a fool of yourself, she hissed. This little crusade of yours isn't going to accomplish anything. Oh, I don't know about that, I said, grinning. People seem pretty interested in your creative bookkeeping. Her face turned an alarming shade of red. I'm warning you. No, Karen, I interrupted. I'm warning you. You messed with the wrong tree. She stomped off, heels clicking furiously against the asphalt. The third step was the cherry on top. A public showdown at the next HOA meeting. HOA meetings were usually dull affairs, attended by maybe 5 people, most of whom just wanted to complain about lawn clippings. But thanks to our flyers and Facebook group, this one was standing room only. The meeting room buzzed with tension as neighbors crowded in, muttering to each other and shooting daggers at Karen, who sat at the head of the table looking increasingly uncomfortable. I waited until the open floor portion of the meeting to make my move. Good evening, I said, standing up and holding a thick folder of evidence. I'm here to address a few concerns. Karen's forced smile was practically trembling. This isn't the time or place for personal grievances. It absolutely is, I interrupted, because this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. I gestured to the crowd. For years, Karen has abused her position to bully, fine, and harass homeowners. She's ignored boundaries, violated property rights, and, let's not forget, destroyed a tree on private property without permission. Someone in the back yelled, "That tree was older than my grandpa." The room erupted in murmurs. Karen looked like she wanted to sink into the floor, but I wasn't done. And that's not all, I said, pulling out a copy of Ron's documents. We have evidence of financial misconduct. Thousands of dollars in HOA dues that can't be accounted for. Payments to non-existent contractors. Inflated expenses. All signed off by Karen Whitaker. The murmurs turned into outright gasps. This is outrageous, Karen sputtered. These accusations are baseless. They're not, I said, slapping the documents onto the table. And I've already sent copies to the sheriff's office and a lawyer. So if you'd like to explain yourself, now's your chance. The room went silent. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Finally, someone in the audience stood up. It was Phil. "I think it's time for a vote of no confidence," he said loudly. The crowd erupted in cheers. By the end of the night, Karen was removed from her position as HOA president. It wasn't a clean break. There were still legal battles ahead, especially over the financial misconduct, but it was a start. And as I walked away from that meeting, past what was left of my favorite tree, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. Karen had messed with the wrong neighbor. Karen's removal as HOA president was only the first act in this drama. The real fireworks started when my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Linda Garvey, got involved. Linda was the kind of person who could make a grown man cry with a single raised eyebrow, and I knew she was exactly who I needed to finish what I'd started. After handing over all the evidence, including Ron's meticulous financial records and the photos of my mutilated tree, Linda got to work. She filed 2 lawsuits on my behalf, one for trespassing and property damage, and another for emotional distress. Because honestly, watching them destroy the tree had left a gaping hole in more than just my yard. And because Linda was thorough and a bit of a shark, she also tipped off the county about Karen's financial misconduct. That meant Karen wasn't just facing civil lawsuits. She was also under investigation for fraud. Meanwhile, the HOA was in chaos. Without Karen at the helm, the remaining board members, most of whom had probably joined just for the free donuts at meetings, didn't know what to do. They called an emergency election to replace her, but it didn't exactly go smoothly. Phil, of all people, ended up running for HOA president on an anti-Karen platform. His campaign slogan, "Less rules, more freedom." He gave a rousing speech about cutting through the HOA's red tape and respecting property owners' rights, which ended with him pointing at me and saying, "And no one's cutting down another damn tree." He won in a landslide. While Phil was busy cleaning up the HOA's mess, I focused on building my case. Linda had me collect every scrap of evidence I could find. Invoices, emails, even screenshots of Karen's passive-aggressive posts in the neighborhood Facebook group. One post in particular caught Linda's attention. It was a comment Karen had made on a thread about property values, where she'd written, "Some properties in this neighborhood are bringing down the rest of us. That big tree on the corner, for example. It's an eyesore and blocks the view from my living room. If the owner won't take care of it, maybe we should." Linda practically cackled when she saw it. "This proves her motive," she said, tapping the screen. "She didn't cut down that tree for the neighborhood's benefit. She did it for herself. Think she'll admit it in court?" I asked. Linda smirked. "She won't have a choice." The day of the court hearing was overcast, which felt appropriate. Karen showed up in a stiff blazer and heels that clicked dramatically against the courthouse floor. Her lawyer, a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, hovered awkwardly behind her. I, on the other hand, walked in with Linda by my side, and a folder full of evidence tucked under my arm. The hearing started with the judge asking Karen's lawyer if his client wanted to settle. He glanced at Karen, who shook her head so sharply I thought her bun might unravel. "No, Your Honor," he said. "We intend to prove that my client acted within her authority." Linda raised an eyebrow. This should be interesting. The next hour was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, except the train was Karen, and I was driving the wrecking ball. First, Linda presented the evidence that my property wasn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction. She showed the original plat map, deeds, and boundary lines, all of which clearly excluded my house. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that the HOA's rules applied, in spirit, to the entire neighborhood. But the judge shut him down with a curt, "That's not how property law works." Then, Linda moved on to the financial misconduct. She called Ron as a witness, and he walked the court through the missing funds and fake invoices. His voice calm and steady despite Karen glaring daggers at him the entire time. By the time Linda pulled out the Facebook comment where Karen admitted she wanted the tree gone for her own view, Karen looked like she might spontaneously combust. Finally, it was my turn to testify. "I loved that tree," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "My grandfather planted it over 50 years ago. It wasn't just a tree, it was a part of my family's history. And she destroyed it without any warning or permission, just because she thought it was an eyesore." Karen's lawyer half-heartedly objected, claiming I was being overly emotional, but the judge waved him off. When it was Karen's turn to testify, things got even better. She started off smug, insisting she'd acted in the best interest of the community. But under Linda's relentless cross-examination, her composure started to crack. "So you admit you authorized the removal of the tree?" Linda asked. "Yes," Karen said through gritted teeth. "And you did this despite knowing the property wasn't part of the HOA? I thought it was implied." "Implied?" Linda's voice dripped with sarcasm. "So you acted based on an assumption, not actual authority?" Karen shifted uncomfortably. I was trying to maintain property values." Linda leaned in, her expression sharp. "Property values? Or your personal view?" "That's not." "Let me refresh your memory," Linda said, holding up the printed screenshot of Karen's Facebook comment. "Does this look familiar?" Karen's face turned beet red. I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it, then?" Linda pressed. Karen stammered, but no coherent answer came out. The judge had heard enough. The ruling was swift and decisive. Karen was ordered to pay for the full replacement value of the tree, which, as it turned out, was far more than she'd expected. Apparently, mature oak trees don't come cheap. She was also slapped with a fine for trespassing, and the judge referred the financial misconduct evidence to the county prosecutor for further investigation. By the end of the day, Karen looked like she'd aged 10 years. I, on the other hand, walked out of the courthouse with a spring in my step and the satisfaction of knowing justice had been served. Later that evening, I stood in my yard, staring at the jagged stump that used to be my tree. It would take years to grow a new one, but I'd already hired an arborist to help me plant a replacement. It wouldn't be the same, but it was a start. As I leaned against the porch railing, Phil wandered over with a six-pack of beer. "Hell of a show today," he said, cracking open a can and handing it to me. "Thanks," I said, taking a sip. "So what's next?" I smiled. "I guess I wait for Karen's next move. But if she wants another fight, she'll find me ready." And with that, I raised my beer to the stump, to my neighbors, and to the memory of a tree that refused to go quietly.